It's Tuesday, and that means it's time for another episode of Draw This. In this episode, we're going to draw a leaf. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll be using Corel Painter 2015 today. I'm starting with a canvas that's 14 by 14 inches at 300 dpi. Let's turn on the mirror tool, make sure not to move it off center, and then we'll select the detail oils brush and a gray color, and we'll go ahead and make a sketch. Let's start by drawing the stem and the center of the leaf, and then we'll draw all of the radiating lines that kind of come out of that point. And then we'll connect the edges of the leaf. You can go ahead and turn off symmetry at any point to draw asymmetrically and use your eraser as needed. I'm going to select all, cut, and paste so that I can put this on its own layer. I'll set the composite method to multiply and dim the opacity of that layer. Now I'm going to create several layers for each overlapping object, the leaf, the stem, and the veins. I'm going to go ahead and just fill in each of these layers using the scratchboard tool. I'll go ahead and just trace right along the edge and then fill in the center using the paint bucket. I'm going to dim the sketch layer so that I can see what's underneath a little bit better. And let's go ahead and sharpen some of the tips of these points. We'll go ahead and keep using the scratchboard tool for that. You can also use the bulge brush to go ahead and push in towards the pixels and sharpen them to a point. Let's turn on preserve transparency, and we'll go ahead and use the airbrush to shade this leaf a little bit with a darker green color. I'll use a cooler blue-green for the shadows and a warmer yellow-green for the highlights. I'm also going to add in a little bit of pale blue to represent the sky color reflecting off of the leaf. Now I'm going to move to the stem layer, and I'm going to go ahead and add that in with the scratchboard tool. Make sure preserve transparency is turned off, otherwise you won't be able to paint on that blank layer. I'm going to go ahead and widen the bottom of the stem. Next, I'm going to go to the big veins layer, and I'm going to add the major veins. These are the radiating lines that go up the center of the leaf and kind of fan out. I'll use the scratchboard tool for that as well. We'll paint the smaller veins on a separate layer. That'll just give us a little more control over what we're doing, and it's less risk if we mess something up with the smaller veins. We could just delete that layer, and then we don't have to start over on all of the veins. So you kind of want to alternate from one side to the other. Study a picture of a leaf, and that'll give you an idea of where to put these things, but really they just kind of fork out kind of like a tree shape. You don't have to add in all the veins, just do the major ones for now. Let's go ahead and duplicate the small veins layer, and what we want to do is we want to make a light layer and a dark layer. The dark layer will be a multiply composite method, the light layer will be screen. On the small veins light layer, we'll turn on preserve transparency, and we'll go ahead and fill that with a light yellow-green color. And then we'll select the move tool, and we can use the arrow keys on our keyboard just to nudge it slightly, just to give it kind of a 3D effect. And we want to go ahead and move that light layer below the dark layer. And let's fill the big veins layer with that same light color as well. And let's repeat that same process by duplicating the big veins, and then we'll make one layer a dark and one layer a light, and we'll just nudge them apart from each other a little bit. We'll hide the sketch. Next, we'll go ahead and dim the opacity of those layers to try to find a good blend. You can kind of experiment with this and see what works, just kind of play with the opacity of each of those layers. Then we'll go ahead and use the pinch brush to go ahead and pinch some of these veins together at the end so the shadow doesn't separate. And then let's zoom in and out just to evaluate the piece. Generally, if it looks good small, you're on the right track. Next, we want to blur those vein shadow layers with effects, focus, soften. Don't blur it too much, but give it just a little bit to kind of fuzz it. Let's do the same thing for the big veins shadow layer. We'll soften that as well. I think that looks pretty good. Now let's go ahead and save this as a PSD and move over to Photoshop and do some work in Photoshop. Let's go ahead and move the stem shadow and the stem highlight layers next to each other so that we can merge them together with Control E. So merge just the shadows and just the highlights. And then let's add a live effect for a bevel. We'll want to move the light over to where our light source is coming from on the right. We'll make our highlight yellow and our shadow kind of a cool green, and we'll go ahead and size this appropriately so it makes our stem look a little more three-dimensional. We'll click on OK. I think that looks pretty good, and we'll reduce the opacity of that just a little bit to go ahead and blend it in a little bit better. Now we can go ahead and save it again and bring it back into Painter. This will be kind of a back and forth process. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to kind of do a little better job drawing in these stems and make sure they're all connected and then it looks right. I'm zoomed in so I can see it a little bit better. You'll see these stems from far away, so you don't really have to worry too much about making them super detailed, but you do want to make it detailed enough to where it looks right. So anywhere that I overpainted, I'll also erase a little bit with my eraser. Once it's cleaned up, I'm going to do a little more highlighting on it using a bright yellow color. I'll draw this little center thing where the main stem connects. And let's go ahead and move to the stem layer and turn on preserve transparency. Let's go ahead and shade that. This stem is kind of a long cylinder. We'll have it fade from brown to green, so we'll just sample colors using Alt on our keyboard and just kind of build up the main color transition. Then we'll use a smaller brush with a darker color to kind of paint along the very edge of the stem, and that'll help it look nice and cylindrical. I'm going to add a little bit of additional shading to the stems here just to kind of change the color overall. I did that by choosing Select Layer Content on the stems layer. Then I created a new layer, set it to multiply, and then I went ahead and painted, and that paint went on its own layer. So that's kind of a handy trick that you can use. I'm using that here to paint along the leaf edges. Next, I'm going to add some layers for texture. Let's create kind of a nice plant cell texture here. So I'm going to use that same Select Layer Content trick. Then I'm going to create a new layer, name it Texture, and then I'm going to set the composite method to multiply. And now if I paint with something like this organismal big larva texture, and I select the square chalk brush, if I paint, I'll only be able to paint inside of this leaf shape. I won't be able to paint outside as long as that selection is active. Now I went ahead and hid that selection by doing Control-Shift-H, or you can do Show Hide Marquee. What I'm doing here is I'm just changing my paper scale so that the cells are the appropriate size. I think that looks pretty good. I'll paint it on kind of thick, and then I'll go ahead and select a different paper scale. I'll add a mask, I'll select black, and I'll paint, and this will allow me to erase with that same brush so that we don't have such a consistent texture. We just kind of want a little subtle texture. Let's add a new layer for texture using the sponge, and maybe one more layer of texture with some color. Next, I'll go ahead and go to the leaf layer and turn on Preserve Transparency and use the airbrush to lighten some of the edges a little bit. I'll also make the edges look a little bit crumpled on some of the tips. That gives it a more realistic appearance. Then I'm going to just go ahead and add a few more layers of color, light and dark here and there, just to kind of build it up and help it look more 3D. Next, let's go ahead and just merge all of those leaf layers except for the background. We'll select them all with Shift, and then we'll hit Control-E to merge them together. Next, I'm going to use a Distorto to go ahead and paint along the leaf edges to dent them in and reshape them anywhere that I need to. This kind of helps it look a little more realistic, and it gives you an opportunity to sharpen some of the tips and fix some of the leaves if they don't look absolutely perfect. So I'm just going along each leaf and giving it a little bit of frayed edge and just kind of straightening things up wherever I think they need to be straightened. I'll also blend a little bit there in the center, as you can see. I'm going to duplicate the leaf layer. I'm going to call one layer Leaf Shadow. That'll be the bottommost layer, and then I'll use the Move tool to go ahead and move that slightly off to the side away from the light source. I'll set the composite method to multiply, turn on Preserve Transparency, and fill it with kind of a dark blue-gray color. Next, I want to go ahead and turn off Preserve Transparency, and then I'll go to Effects, Focus, Soften, just to kind of fuzz that a little bit and blur it. Make sure Preview's turned on so you can see what you're doing, and just change the amount to something that you like. Next, I'm going to dim the opacity pretty low so that I have just a little bit of a subtle shadow here. Let's go ahead and move back over to Photoshop, and let's add an emboss filter on a duplicate of that layer, and we'll reduce the opacity. That gives it a little bit more crispier of a texture and makes it sharper. Let's also go ahead and just flatten it, and let's add an iris blur. Let's duplicate that layer again, and we'll add an adjustment for shadows and highlights. That gives it a little more contrast. And then let's go ahead and add some adjustment layers for color balance, and that'll give it a nice transition from kind of a cool to a warm color if you use a gradient in your mask. Let's return to Painter again. Let's keep adding more details to these stems, because this is really the main challenge here, is getting all these stems to look right, or veins, or whatever you want to call them. I don't know if they're stems or veins. I should have looked up the technical term here. Nevertheless, just kind of draw in some dark, and then put some light color right next to it, and that'll make it look like a really sharp crease or a little bulging vein that's sticking out of the leaf. I think that looks pretty good. Really, this is just kind of balancing out the contrast at this point, so I'm going to make this lighter and darker and kind of work back and forth until I get something that I'm happy with, because you don't want just kind of a boring, flat green standard leaf. You want there to be a lot of color variety and a lot of variety and contrast in it if you want it to look realistic. And that goes for pretty much anything. So here and there I'm using the distortion brushes, I'm adding layers as I need to, just kind of tweaking it here and there as I go along. I'm going to add some finer veins to the bigger veins, and then I'll go ahead and wrap this up by adding the finishing touches. Now, these finishing touches are always really hard to explain. You really have to kind of be looking back and forth at your reference photo or working on it until you get to a point to where you're satisfied with it. And I have a picture of a leaf that I'm looking back and forth at, and that's kind of giving me a direction, but I'm also changing that direction a little bit artistically and not making it exactly like the reference photo. I added a little more cell texture, and I think we have a finished leaf. If you enjoyed this episode of Draw This, I hope you'll join me every Tuesday for a new episode. And don't forget to click the subscribe button if you'd like to get free updates when I release new videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.